There's a difference between taking a risk and needing to take risks. One is a choice, a calculated decision in a specific moment. You weigh options, assess probabilities, choose the path with acceptable danger because the potential reward justifies it. The other is a pattern, compulsion, a way of operating where risk isn't something you occasionally accept but something you constantly require, where safety becomes intolerable, where the cautious path feels like failure even when it's rational. Caesar lived in the second category. Not occasionally, not just during his famous moments, crossing the Rubicon, invading Britain, the Civil War, but constantly, systematically, throughout his entire career. He took risks when he didn't need to, when safer alternatives existed, when prudence would have served him better. And this wasn't recklessness. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't the behavior of someone who couldn't assess danger. Caesar was brilliant at calculating odds, at reading situations, at understanding what could go wrong. He took risks knowing they were risks, deliberately, consciously, as a method. But here's what's strange. He couldn't stop, even when the risks stopped making strategic sense, even when the pattern started working against him, even when people around him, allies, advisors, friends, could see that he was pushing too hard, going too far, making enemies he didn't need to make. The question isn't why Caesar took risks. That's obvious. Ambition, competition, the nature of Roman politics. The question is why he never stopped. Why risk became the only mode he operated in. Why he couldn't shift to consolidation, to security, to the kind of careful statecraft that might have kept him alive. Because there's a pattern here, a trajectory. Caesar rose through risk, built his career on it, made his reputation through audacious moves that worked because people didn't expect them. And then the pattern trapped him, made safety impossible, made caution look like weakness, made every choice a referendum on whether he was still Caesar or whether he had become something lesser, something careful, something finished. This is about what happens when risk stops being a tool and becomes an identity. When the method that brings you success becomes the thing that prevents you from keeping it. When you can't distinguish between the risks that serve your goals and the risks you take because not taking them would mean admitting something about yourself you can't accept. Caesar never stopped taking risks, and that fact shaped everything. His rise, his achievements, his enemies, and ultimately his death. To understand why Caesar operated this way, you need to understand the world that shaped him. Late Republican Rome wasn't a place that rewarded caution. It was a political system in terminal crisis. The institutions that were supposed to regulate competition had broken down. The informal rules that prevented total conflict no longer held. And the result was an environment where safety was impossible and prudence could get you destroyed as easily as recklessness. The core problem was that political power and legal vulnerability were linked. To hold high office in Rome, consul, praetor, any significant magistracy, you had immunity from prosecution. Your official status protected you. But the moment your term ended, you became vulnerable. Anyone with a grievance could bring charges. Political enemies could prosecute you for actions taken in office. And the courts were political instruments. Juries were selected based on factional loyalties. Verdicts depended on who had more influence, not on facts or law. This meant that once you entered politics at a high level, you couldn't safely leave. You couldn't retire to private life, because retirement meant prosecution, exile, confiscation of property, sometimes death. The only protection was holding office continuously, staying immune, staying powerful enough that bringing charges against you was too dangerous for your enemies. But you couldn't hold office continuously under Republican rules. Terms were limited. There were mandatory intervals between positions. Technically, there were supposed to be periods where you were private citizen, vulnerable. And during those periods, you either had enough allies to make prosecution too costly, or you were finished. This created perverse incentives. It meant ambitious men couldn't moderate, couldn't build consensus, couldn't compromise, because compromise created enemies, and enemies would prosecute you the moment you lost protection. The rational strategy was to be aggressive, to accumulate power quickly, to make yourself too dangerous to attack. And if that required breaking norms, antagonizing institutions, making more enemies, well, you were making enemies anyway. Might as well make them from a position of strength. Caesar came of age watching this dynamic destroy people. Sulla's proscriptions in the 80s BC killed thousands. Sulla's political opponents, their families, anyone associated with them, not through legal process but through organized political murder. The message was clear: losing isn't just losing, it's death, exile, the destruction of everything you and your family have. The period after Sulla was slightly less violent but not less dangerous. Men went into exile to avoid prosecution, lost fortunes defending themselves in political trials, saw careers destroyed by legal attacks that were really factional warfare. The courts became weapons. Every magistrate knew that their actions in office would be scrutinized by enemies looking for any procedural irregularity, any excess, any basis for bringing charges. And this wasn't paranoia. The danger was real, documented, constant. Even successful politicians lived with the knowledge that they were one failed election, one lost court case, one shift in factional dynamics away from losing everything. In this environment, caution didn't protect you. Trying to avoid making enemies was impossible because the system itself created enemies. Your success was someone else's blocked opportunity. Your rise was someone else's threatened position. Neutrality wasn't an option because the factions demanded loyalty. Sitting out conflicts meant making enemies of both sides. The people who survived were the ones who understood that safety came from power, not from moderation. That you needed to be too valuable to allies and too dangerous to enemies for anyone to risk moving against you. That the way to protect yourself was to keep winning, keep advancing, keep accumulating the resources and positions that made you immune. Caesar learned this early. His family had connections to Marius, Sulla's enemy. That made him suspect during Sulla's dictatorship. He was young, relatively unimportant, but he was on the wrong side, and being on the wrong side meant danger. He managed to survive through connections, through leaving Rome, through being too minor to bother with. But he learned. He understood that this could happen again. That political defeat in Rome wasn't just defeat. It was existential. So when he entered politics, he did it with that understanding. That half measures were worthless. That you couldn't build a career on being inoffensive. That the only reliable protection was being formidable. That risk was necessary because safety was illusory. Caesar's early career was built on deliberate, calculated risks that shouldn't have worked but did. The first major one was debt. Enormous debt. He borrowed staggering amounts of money to fund his political career, to hold games, to build public works, to provide entertainment and patronage that would make him popular with Roman voters. The amounts were so large that if his political advancement had stalled, he would have been financially ruined, couldn't have paid it back, would have been vulnerable to his creditors, to his political enemies who could use his debt as leverage. This wasn't reckless borrowing. It was strategic. Roman politics required spending. You needed to be generous, visible, memorable. The public expected candidates to provide games, festivals, construction projects. And the scale of your spending signaled your seriousness, your commitment, your importance. Spending modestly meant you weren't serious about power, that you could be ignored. But here's the risk. You were borrowing against future success, against positions you hoped to win but hadn't won yet, against the assumption that you would rise far enough that the income and opportunities from high office would let you repay the debts. If you won, you could pay back the loans and profit. If you lost, you were destroyed. Caesar borrowed amounts that made failure catastrophic. He made himself dependent on success, on keeping winning, on rising to positions where he could access the resources needed to clear the debts. This wasn't a backup plan. It was commitment. He had structured his life so that stopping meant ruin. And it worked, partly because the spending made him popular, partly because the creditors saw that he was serious and backed him further, partly because once you're that deeply in debt to powerful people, they have an interest in your success. If you fail, they lose their investment. So they help you, provide more resources, use their influence, not out of charity but because your survival is tied to their returns. The second calculated risk was public positioning. Caesar aligned himself with populist causes, with the reform faction, with policies that made him popular with voters but antagonized the Senate's conservative majority. He defended people accused of crimes against the state, supported land redistribution, advocated for veterans. All of this built his public profile, made him known, made him a figure that represented something. But it also made permanent enemies. The optimates, the conservative faction, saw him as a threat, as someone dangerous, as part of the pattern of populist politicians who destabilized the republic. They would oppose him, block him, prosecute him if given the chance. And unlike temporary political opponents, these were ideological enemies, people who saw your entire approach to politics as illegitimate. The safe path was to moderate, to build relationships across factions, to be someone both sides could work with. That's how you built a sustainable career, how you avoided making the kind of enemies who would destroy you the first chance they got. Caesar chose the opposite. He made himself factional, partisan. He built his base among the people and the reform faction and accepted that this meant permanent opposition from the conservative establishment. This was risk, real risk, because if the political balance shifted against him, if his faction lost power, he would be exposed, vulnerable, target for all the enemies he had made. The third risk was military command. Caesar pursued military positions aggressively. Not the prestigious but safe commands, the risky ones. Hispania, Gaul, places where there was actual fighting, where things could go wrong, where failure meant military defeat, lost legions, personal disgrace. Military success in Rome was the fastest path to political power. Generals got triumphs, public celebrations, massive prestige, loyal veterans who would support you in politics, access to wealth from conquests. But military failure was catastrophic. You lost credibility, lost support, became an example of incompetence. And you couldn't hide failure, couldn't spin it. Lost battles were public, documented, undeniable. Caesar took commands where success wasn't guaranteed, where he would be facing serious opposition, where the military challenges were real. And he didn't just take the commands. He escalated them, pushed beyond his mandate, invaded Britain, crossed the Rhine, fought campaigns that went beyond what was necessary or authorized. Each escalation was risk. Risk of military defeat, risk of political backlash for exceeding his authority, risk of making enemies who would use his ambition against him. But each success built his legend, made him more formidable, more popular, more impossible to ignore. The Gallic campaigns made him the most successful general of his generation, gave him a veteran army loyal to him personally, created a public image of invincibility that his political enemies couldn't compete with. The pattern was clear early. Caesar took risks that made failure catastrophic but success transformative. He structured his life so that caution was impossible, so that he had to keep advancing, keep winning, keep taking the next risk because stopping meant exposure to all the vulnerabilities he had created. And it worked. For decades, the debts got repaid. The enemies got outmaneuvered. The military campaigns succeeded. The risks paid off. But they also locked him into a trajectory, pattern, a way of operating where risk wasn't something you calculated case by case but something you required constantly, where the only forward movement was escalation. At some point, Caesar's willingness to take risks stopped being a tactic and became his identity. People expected it from him. Allies, enemies, the public. Everyone watching Roman politics understood that Caesar was the one who would push further than others, who would do what cautious men wouldn't, who would gamble when prudent politicians hedged. This wasn't just reputation. It was pressure. Once you're known as the person who takes audacious risks, you can't suddenly become careful. Can't start choosing safe options. Can't be seen backing down. Because that looks like weakness. Like you've lost your nerve. Like you're finished. The expectation becomes a cage. You have to keep being what people think you are. Even when the situation doesn't call for it. Even when caution would serve you better. Because if you stop, everyone notices. Everyone interprets it. Caesar's supporters needed him to be bold. They had bet on him precisely because he wasn't cautious. Because he delivered results through aggressive action. Through doing what others wouldn't. If he became moderate, careful, strategic in the conventional sense, why would they support him over someone else? His enemies needed him to be reckless. They were building their case against him on the argument that he was dangerous, unstable, a threat to the Republic. If he suddenly became responsible, measured, respectful of norms, their narrative collapsed. So they pushed him, challenged him, created situations where backing down would look weak, where the cautious choice would be interpreted as surrender. And the public, they had their own expectations. Caesar was entertainment, drama, the figure you watched to see what would happen next, what audacious move he would make, what impossible situation he would navigate through sheer boldness. That was the character. That was the appeal. A Caesar who played it safe was boring, irrelevant, not worth following. So he couldn't stop. The role demanded continuation, escalation. Each successful risk raised the baseline for what counted as bold. What had been daring yesterday became normal today. Tomorrow required something more. Look at the Gallic campaigns. He didn't just conquer Gaul. He invaded Britain. Twice. Britain wasn't necessary. Wasn't part of any strategic plan. Was barely known to Romans. The military value was minimal. The risk was substantial. Bad weather. Unknown terrain. Potential disaster. But the symbolic value was enormous. No Roman had done it. No one had crossed the ocean to that distant, mysterious island. It was pure audacity. Pure Cesar. The kind of move that made people talk. That reinforced the image. That proved he was still the man who did impossible things. Or the Rhine Bridge. He needed to cross the Rhine to chase Germanic tribes. Could have used boats. Standard procedure. Safe. But instead he built a bridge. A massive timber bridge. Across a major river. In hostile territory. In days. Why? Because it was impressive. Because it demonstrated Roman engineering. Because it sent a message. Because Caesar didn't just accomplish objectives. He accomplished them in ways that became stories. That built legend. That reinforced who he was. The problem is that this kind of reputation is expensive to maintain. Each success raises expectations. Each bold move resets the baseline. You can't do the same thing twice and get the same reaction. Familiarity breeds indifference. To maintain the impact, you need escalation. And at some point, the escalation serves the image more than the objectives. You're taking risks not because they're the best strategic choice, but because not taking them would mean being seen as something other than Caesar. As diminished. As past your prime. As careful. This is the trap. When your effectiveness depends on being perceived as bold, you lose the freedom to be strategic. Strategy sometimes requires patience, caution, choosing the boring option because it works. But if choosing the boring option damages your reputation for boldness, then you can't choose it. Even when it's right. Caesar's enemies understood this. They could predict him, could provoke him, could create situations where the cautious response was the smart response. knowing he would reject it precisely because it was cautious, because accepting it would mean accepting that he had limits, that he could be contained, that he was capable of backing down. And he couldn't, not without becoming someone else, someone who wasn't Caesar. And if he wasn't Caesar, if he was just another talented politician, another successful general, another ambitious man navigating Roman politics, then what was the point? Why had he taken all those risks, made all those enemies, built all that debt, pushed all those boundaries? The identity became self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating. Caesar took risks because he was Caesar, and he was Caesar because he took risks. The reputation and the behavior fed each other, created a loop where stepping back wasn't just difficult. It was psychologically impossible. It would mean admitting something he couldn't admit, that the role had limits, that there were lines he couldn't cross, that eventually caution becomes necessary. But Caesar never made that admission, never adjusted the pattern, never learned to distinguish between risks that served him and risks he took to remain himself. The reputation that had built his career became the thing that locked him into escalation, that made every choice a test of whether he was still Caesar or whether he had become something lesser, something careful, something finished. And the answer was always the same, always had to be the same. He was still Caesar, which meant the risks continued, the escalation continued, the pattern continued, until it didn't, until the one risk that couldn't be walked back, that couldn't be survived, that couldn't be controlled. But that's later. For now, the pattern holds. The reputation demands. The risks continue. And Caesar remains Caesar. Bold, audacious, unstoppable. Exactly what everyone expects. Exactly what the role requires. Exactly what will eventually destroy him. There were moments where Caesar could have stopped, where retreat was possible, where a reasonable man would have recognized the warning signs and pulled back. He saw those moments clearly, understood exactly what he was doing, and crossed the lines anyway, deliberately, consciously, not because he had to, because he chose to. The first triumvirate is the clearest early example. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus formed an informal alliance to control Roman politics. They coordinated, shared resources, supported each other's objectives, used their combined influence to override Senate opposition. This wasn't illegal, but it was exactly the kind of factional cooperation that Romans feared, that undermined the republic's institutional balance, that concentrated power in ways the system was designed to prevent. Caesar knew this, knew it made enemies, knew it confirmed every suspicion the optimates had about him, that he was dangerous, that he didn't respect norms, that he would break the system to get what he wanted. He could have built power more slowly, more carefully, through traditional alliances, through working within the existing structures. It would have taken longer, but it would have been safer, less provocative, less likely to trigger organized opposition. He chose the triumvirate instead, chose the faster, riskier path, the one that delivered immediate results but made permanent enemies. And he did it knowing exactly what he was doing, what he was risking, what he was signaling. The Gallic campaigns show the same pattern. Caesar had authorization to govern Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul. Standard provincial assignment. He was supposed to defend Roman territory, manage relations with tribes, maintain stability. Instead, he launched a war of conquest, systematically conquered all of Gaul, pushed beyond his mandate, exceeded his authorization, extended Roman control over territory that Rome hadn't asked him to conquer. This wasn't mission creep, wasn't gradual expansion of scope. This was deliberate escalation. He saw opportunities and took them, saw threats and used them as justification for expansion, turned every incident into a reason for further conquest. And each expansion was a calculated risk. Each new campaign was unauthorized. Each victory made him more powerful but also more threatening to his political enemies. Each success proved he was capable of acting independently, of building his own power base, of creating military facts that Rome would have to accept. The Senate couldn't stop him. He was too far away, too successful. His legions were loyal to him. His conquests were popular with the Roman public. Trying to recall him would provoke a crisis. So they let it continue. Let him build an army, build a reputation, build a position that would eventually become incompatible with Republican norms. Caesar knew this, understood that every campaign made his return to normal politics harder, that he was creating a situation where he would be too powerful to reintegrate safely, where his enemies would see him as an existential threat, where compromise would become impossible. He did it anyway, because the military success gave him leverage, resources, prestige, an army that could protect him from prosecution, from the political vulnerability that had destroyed others. He was trading long-term stability for immediate power, making himself too formidable to attack but also too dangerous to trust. The invasion of Britain makes this explicit. There was no strategic necessity. No Roman interest required it. Britain was distant, difficult to access, militarily irrelevant to Gaul. The campaign risked his army for no clear objective. But it was symbolic, audacious, unprecedented. It reinforced his image as the man who did what others wouldn't, who pushed boundaries, who achieved the impossible. And that image was valuable, worth the military risk, worth the political provocation. Or consider his relationship with the Senate during the campaigns. He didn't just ignore instructions. He openly defied them, wrote dispatches that were barely respectful, made it clear that he considered himself the authority in Gaul, that he would make decisions based on his judgment, not theirs. This was deliberate provocation, deliberate crossing of lines. He was testing how far he could push, how much independence he could claim, how openly he could disregard Senate authority before they would act against him. And each time they didn't act, each time they accepted his defiance because the alternative was worse, he learned. He learned that boldness worked, that crossing lines delivered results, that the people who worried about norms were the ones who lost, that in a broken system, the man willing to break rules had the advantage. The pattern became consistent. Identify a boundary, test it, cross it, see what happens. If opposition materialized, escalate. If no effective opposition appeared, cross the next boundary. Each transgression normalized the next. Each success made the previous risk look prudent. By 50 BC, Caesar had built an impossible position. He was the most successful general of his generation, commanded veteran legions loyal to him personally, had conquered territory that expanded Rome's domain enormously, was popular with the public, wealthy from the conquests, politically formidable, but he was also illegal. His term as governor was ending. His immunity would expire. His enemies in the Senate had charges ready. He would have to give up his army, return to Rome as a private citizen, face prosecution for the unauthorized actions he had taken in Gaul, for exceeding his mandate, for acting independently, for building personal power. And everyone knew what prosecution meant. Not just legal jeopardy, political destruction, exile. The end of his career. Everything he had built would be dismantled. Everyone who had supported him would be vulnerable. He could have negotiated, could have sought compromise, could have traded some of his gains for immunity, accepted a reduced position in exchange for safety. Many of his allies counseled this, tried to find a middle path, a way to preserve something without risking everything. But that would have meant admitting limits, accepting that there were lines he couldn't cross, that his enemies could contain him through institutional means, that the boldness that had built his career had reached its boundary. Caesar rejected compromise, rejected caution. rejected the idea that he needed to accept terms from people he had spent years outmaneuvering. He had crossed every previous line successfully, had turned every risk into opportunity, had proven that audacity worked where caution failed. So he crossed the final line, the one that couldn't be uncrossed, the one that turned political conflict into civil war, the one that everyone knew was absolute, the boundary that separated ambitious politician from enemy of the state. He crossed the Rubicon, with his army, in direct violation of law, knowing exactly what it meant, what it would trigger, what it would cost. Not because he had no choice. He had choices. Negotiation was possible. Compromise was offered. Safety could have been arranged. But accepting it would have meant being someone other than Caesar. Someone who retreated, who accepted limits, who chose security over risk, who admitted that boldness had boundaries. And he couldn't do that, wouldn't do that, because crossing lines on purpose wasn't just a tactic anymore. It was who he was, what he did, how he operated, the pattern that had brought him this far, the method that had never failed, until it did, until the risk became war, until crossing the line meant destroying the system, until audacity meant catastrophe, until the pattern that had built his career made peace impossible, made compromise unacceptable, made the final risk inevitable. The Civil War changed everything, and nothing. Caesar won. Decisively. Pompey fled to Egypt and was killed. The Senate's forces were defeated. The Republic's institutions collapsed. Within a few years, Caesar controlled Rome absolutely, held unprecedented power, had achieved what no Roman had achieved before. But he was trapped. More trapped than when he was just a general in Gaul. More trapped than when he was navigating factional politics. Trapped by the very success that had brought him absolute power. Because now safety was impossible. Legitimacy was impossible. The normal rules didn't apply and couldn't apply. He had broken the Republic to seize control. And everyone knew it. Everyone remembered it. Everyone understood that his authority rested on force, on victory, on the army that had won the Civil War. This meant he couldn't retreat to normalcy, couldn't become a regular magistrate again, couldn't restore the Republic and take his place within it. The Republic was the thing he had destroyed. The institutions were the things he had overridden. The Senate was the body he had defeated militarily. His previous risks had been calculated gambles. This one, the Civil War, had eliminated the option of not risking, had created a situation where the only path forward was more risk, more consolidation, more control, because any weakness would invite challenge. Any sign of retreat would trigger collapse. Look at how he handled the Senate after victory. He didn't abolish it, didn't formally end the Republic. He kept the institutions, kept the forms, called himself dictator, which was a legitimate emergency office, maintained the appearance of Republican government. But everyone knew it was fiction. The Senate met but couldn't oppose him. Elections happened but the outcomes were controlled. The institutions functioned but only because he allowed them to. His clemency toward defeated enemies was real, but it was his clemency, his choice to spare them, his decision to be merciful, which meant it could be withdrawn. This created a specific problem. He needed the institutions to legitimize his rule, to make his power look legal, constitutional, continuous with Roman tradition. But the institutions only functioned because he controlled them, which meant they couldn't actually legitimize him. Everyone knew the reality. Everyone understood that the forms were hollow, that his authority came from victory, not from law. So he couldn't relax, couldn't let the institutions function independently, couldn't allow genuine opposition, because any real challenge would expose the fiction, would force him to choose between maintaining control and maintaining the appearance of constitutional government. And choosing control would prove what everyone suspected, that he was a tyrant, that the Republic was dead, that all the forms were meaningless. But he also couldn't rule purely through force, couldn't be openly autocratic, because Romans hated kings, hated tyranny, had a deep cultural resistance to one-man rule. If he dropped the pretense, if he admitted what he actually was, the opposition would become principled, ideological. People would resist him not just because he was their factional enemy, but because he represented everything Romans claimed to reject. So he was stuck, maintaining a fiction that required constant effort, constant management, constant risk that someone would force him to drop the pretense, would create a situation where he had to choose between appearing weak and appearing tyrannical. His previous risks had been optional, strategic choices, calculated moves where success brought advantage and failure brought consequences he could manage. These weren't optional. These were the price of the previous victory, the ongoing cost of the Civil War, the inescapable result of crossing the Rubicon. And the risks kept coming. He couldn't eliminate all his enemies. His clemency policy meant former opponents remained in Rome, in the Senate, some holding positions, some nursing grievances, some waiting for opportunity. He knew this, knew that mercy created risk, but killing them all would make him a monster, would trigger exactly the kind of resistance that could destabilize everything. So he lived with the danger, managed it, tried to co-opt former enemies, give them positions, show them that cooperation was better than opposition. Some accepted, some genuinely reconciled, others pretended, waited, calculated. He couldn't build lasting institutions, couldn't create a system that would survive him, because any system strong enough to last would be strong enough to challenge him. Any institution with real authority would become a power center, a potential source of opposition. So everything remained personal, temporary, dependent on him. This meant he couldn't rest, couldn't delegate, couldn't trust the system to function without his direct oversight. Because there was no system, just him, his authority, his decision-making, his constant management of an impossible situation. And he knew it couldn't last, knew that personal rule dies with the person, that everything he had built would collapse the moment he wasn't there to maintain it, that his victory in the Civil War had given him power but not stability, control but not legitimacy, success but not resolution. The final risk wasn't something he chose. It was the inevitable result of all the previous choices, of crossing the Rubicon, of winning the Civil War, of becoming the man who had broken the Republic. That created a situation where risk was continuous, unavoidable, built into every day, every decision, every interaction. He couldn't go back, couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't return to being just another ambitious politician navigating Republican institutions. The Civil War had made that impossible, had created a reality where the only options were control or collapse, authority or chaos, risk or death, and he chose risk, every day, not because he was reckless, not because he enjoyed danger, but because the alternatives were worse, because the pattern that had brought him here had eliminated the other paths, because once you cross certain lines, retreat stops being an option, safety becomes impossible, and risk becomes the only mode you can operate in. Not optional risk, not calculated risk, not risk as strategy, but risk as reality, as the ongoing price of previous victory, as the inescapable consequence of being Caesar. By 44 BC, everyone could see what Caesar couldn't, or wouldn't, that the situation was unsustainable, that he had concentrated too much power, made too many enemies, created too many contradictions, that something had to give. His friends warned him, told him to be careful, to increase his security, to stop appearing in public without adequate protection, to take the threats seriously. He dismissed them, not because he didn't understand the danger. He understood it perfectly, better than most, He had spent his entire career assessing risk, reading political situations, understanding who wanted what and what they were capable of. But he couldn't act on the warnings, couldn't become the kind of leader who hid behind guards, who showed fear, who admitted vulnerability, because that would mean admitting that the risks had limits, that boldness had consequences, that Caesar could be threatened into caution. And he couldn't do that, couldn't be that. The pattern wouldn't allow it. This is what happens when risk becomes identity, when the method becomes the man. You lose the ability to adjust, to adapt, to change course when the situation changes, because changing course would mean becoming someone else, someone you can't accept being. Caesar had built his entire career on being the one who didn't retreat, who didn't show weakness, who crossed lines others feared, who took risks that cautious men avoided. That was the pattern. That was who he was. That was what had brought him from minor aristocrat to master of Rome. And now the pattern demanded continuation, demanded that he keep being Caesar, keep demonstrating fearlessness, keep refusing to be contained or cautious or careful, even when caution was rational, even when the threats were credible, even when the warnings were coming from people who wanted him to survive. The conspirators understood this. They were counting on it. They knew Caesar wouldn't hide, wouldn't surround himself with guards, wouldn't cancel Senate meetings because of threats, because doing any of that would be admission, would be weakness, would be proof that he could be intimidated. So they planned openly, not openly enough to be stopped, but openly enough that rumors circulated, that warnings reached him, that he had every opportunity to take precautions, to protect himself, to survive. He chose not to, chose to attend the Senate meeting, chose to dismiss his guards, chose to walk into a room full of men who wanted him dead, not because he didn't know the danger, but because acknowledging the danger meant changing the pattern, meant becoming careful, meant admitting that there were situations where boldness wasn't the answer. And he couldn't make that admission. The psychological cost was too high. The identity was too fixed. The pattern was too established. Being Caesar meant not backing down, not showing fear, not letting threats change your behavior. So he walked into the Senate, into the conspirators, into the knives, into the death that everyone except him seemed to know was coming. 23 stab wounds on the floor of the Senate, bleeding out while the men who had planned his death stood over him. The boldness that had built his career made his murder possible, made it easy, made it almost inevitable, because the pattern had become rigid, inflexible, unable to adapt to changed circumstances, unable to recognize that what worked when rising to power becomes liability when trying to maintain it. His final words, according to tradition, were "Et Brute, and you, Brutus?" addressed to someone he had trusted, someone he had shown mercy to, someone who had been included in his clemency, his attempts at reconciliation. But the question misses the point. The conspiracy wasn't personal betrayal. It was institutional response. It was what happened when you concentrated power to a degree the system couldn't absorb, when you made yourself the republic's master while pretending to be its servant, when you created a situation where the only way to restore balance was to remove you, and you made it easy, made it possible, made it successful, because you couldn't stop being who you were, couldn't adjust the pattern, couldn't accept that risk sometimes requires giving way to caution, that boldness sometimes means knowing when to protect yourself, that strength includes knowing your vulnerabilities and addressing them. Caesar never learned that, never accepted it. The pattern that had built his career became the thing that killed him. The risks that had brought him to absolute power made that power unsustainable. The reputation that had made him formidable made him predictable. The identity that had defined his success made adaptation impossible. And the result was inevitable, not because the conspirators were particularly clever, Not because the plot was especially sophisticated, but because Caesar was consistent, predictably consistent, reliably bold, incapable of the kind of caution that would have saved him. He died as he lived, taking risks, refusing to retreat, being Caesar until the last moment, until the knives, until the pattern finally ran out, until the risk that he couldn't survive, couldn't control, couldn't turn into opportunity. The man who never stopped taking risks, who built an empire on audacity, who crossed every line and won every gamble, died because he couldn't stop, couldn't change, couldn't become someone who valued survival over consistency, safety over identity, life over the pattern that had defined it. That's the final tragedy. Not that he died, but that he died in a way that was completely consistent with how he lived. That the end was implicit in the method. That the pattern guaranteed the outcome. That Caesar killed Caesar by being exactly who he had always been. So what was the risk Caesar never stopped taking? It wasn't military, wasn't political in the simple sense. It was deeper, more fundamental, the risk of remaining himself, of staying consistent with the pattern that had brought him success, of refusing to adapt when adaptation became necessary. This is different from courage. Courage is choosing risk when it serves your goals, when the potential reward justifies the danger, when boldness is the right strategy for the situation you're in. What Caesar did was something else. He made risk into identity, made boldness into character, made audacity into the thing that defined him. And once that happened, once the method became inseparable from the man, he lost the ability to choose, lost the flexibility to be strategic about when to push and when to protect, when to escalate and when to consolidate. The pattern that brought him to power became the thing that made power unsustainable. The reputation that made him formidable made him predictable. The consistency that built his career made him rigid. And rigidity in a changing environment is fatal. This matters now, not because we're navigating late Republican Rome, but because the dynamic is universal. The pattern appears everywhere. In business, in politics, in any competitive environment where success requires boldness. You find something that works, a method, an approach, a way of operating that brings results, and you double down on it, refine it, make it your signature, your brand, your identity, and for a while it works brilliantly. The consistency pays off. The specialization brings advantages. Being known for one thing makes you the obvious choice for that thing. But environments change. What worked in rising doesn't always work in sustaining. What brings you success can become the thing that prevents you from keeping it. And if you've made the method into your identity, if you've become the person who does things this particular way, you lose the ability to recognize when the situation requires something different. Caesar's lesson isn't don't take risks. It's don't become the risk taker. Don't make any single approach so central to who you are that you can't abandon it when circumstances change. Don't build an identity so rigid that adaptation looks like failure, because that's what happened to him. Adaptation would have meant admitting that the pattern had limits, that boldness wasn't always the answer, that sometimes caution serves you better than consistency. And he couldn't make that admission, psychologically couldn't, because it would mean being someone other than Caesar, someone diminished, someone who had lost what made them special. So he stayed consistent, stayed bold, stayed true to the pattern, right up until the moment when that pattern killed him. When the risk he couldn't stop taking was the risk of being himself, of remaining Caesar, of refusing to become something safer, something that might survive. The tragedy isn't that he died. Mortality is universal. The tragedy is that he died in a way that was completely avoidable, that the warnings were clear, that the danger was obvious, that protection was possible, and he rejected it, not because he was reckless, not because he couldn't assess danger, but because accepting protection would mean accepting that there were situations where boldness failed, where the pattern didn't work, where Caesar needed to become someone else to survive. And he chose death over that, chose consistency over adaptation, chose being Caesar over being alive, not consciously, not as a deliberate decision, but as the inevitable result of a lifetime of reinforcing the same pattern, of making risk into identity, of building a self that couldn't bend without breaking. That's the risk he never stopped taking, the risk of remaining himself, of being consistent when consistency became fatal, of staying true to a pattern that had outlived its usefulness, of choosing identity over survival. It's the subtlest risk, the hardest one to see, the one that doesn't look like risk because it looks like strength, like character, like the courage to be yourself no matter what. And sometimes it is that. Sometimes consistency is virtue. Sometimes refusing to change is exactly right. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes the situation changes enough that the old pattern becomes liability. That what brought you here won't take you there. That the method needs updating even if the goals remain the same. The wisdom is knowing the difference. Knowing when to hold the pattern and when to break it. When consistency serves you and when it traps you. When being yourself means strength and when it means rigidity. Caesar never learned that distinction. Never developed the flexibility to be strategic about his own identity. Never recognized that the risk-taking that built his career had become the thing that made his position impossible to sustain. And that's the lesson. Not that boldness is wrong, not that risk should be avoided, but that any pattern taken to extreme becomes a cage. Any identity held too rigidly becomes a liability. Any strength pushed too far becomes weakness. The risk Caesar never stopped taking was the risk of being Caesar. Completely, consistently, without adaptation, without flexibility, without the wisdom to know when the pattern needed to change. And it killed him, not dramatically, not unpredictably, but exactly as it had to, as it always would. Once the pattern became rigid enough, once the identity became fixed enough, once adaptation became impossible without becoming someone else. That's the risk, that's the pattern, that's the lesson. In Caesar's time, and in ours.